Hello and welcome from me and from Mike Collins to this Zoom series, Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference. It's a series where we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. And today we welcome Cóilín Parsons talking about James Joyce's Ulysses. Cóilín is Associate Professor of English at Georgetown University, where he also directs the Global Irish Studies Initiative and holds the Sorbonne Chair in Interdisciplinary Collaboration. He is author of the Ordnance Survey and Modern Irish Literature, Oxford University Press in 2016, and editor or co-editor of Relocations, Reading Culture in South Africa, the University of Cape Town Press, and Science, Technology and Irish Modernism, the Syracuse University Press, 2019, and Transnationalism in Irish Literature and Culture, which is due for publication by Cambridge University Press this summer in 2024. If you have any questions during the course of Cóilín's talk, please type them in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Use the Q&A button, please, and not the chat button on your computer. Towards the end, Mike Collins and I will put these questions to Cóilín, and he'll try to answer as many as he can. Please don't leave your questions until the last minute, as we may run out of time. Now, if Cóilín puts on his video, we're ready to go. Welcome. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Michael, and to Mike Collins as well, and Mary Gordon, who's hiding here in the background and who gathered us all here today. It's nice to see. I just looked at our group of participants or attendees. Nice to see some names that I recognize. We're a tidy, comfortable bunch here today. I'm delighted to join the conversation, Cultural Encounters, Books That Make a Difference. And in fact, one of those books that Michael mentioned that I edited, Relocations, Reading Culture in South Africa, arose out of a similar set of public encounters, let's just say, or public engagements on the question, under the title, Great Texts, Big Questions. And so when I was asked to join this conversation, I thought I might speak, as I always do, about the dead, but Mike Collins stole it ahead of me. And I hope you all caught Mike Collins' talk a few weeks ago, which is really fantastic. I am going to share my screen here and get started. You should be able to see a slideshow there. And if there are any difficulties, somebody can jump in and let me know. Ulysses is a book filled with descriptions of the feeling of encounters, taken in the broadest sense of the word. The entire day of the 16th of June, 1904 is for Leopold Bloom a painful lead-up to an encounter between his wife Molly Bloom and her soon-to-be lover Blazes Boylan. Meanwhile, Bloom and Stephen Daedalus, for different reasons, find themselves roaming the streets of Dublin, having their own brief encounters with a host of characters whom they often know, but usually not very well. This paper will trace some of these, but it'll concentrate on another sort of encounter between this novel and students, and between this novel and South Africa. And I'll explain all of that later. A constant presence through the book, South Africa turns up as an image of anti-colonial revolt for the most part, marking an unfolding colonial crisis elsewhere that foreshadows Dublin's own, which of course is unfolding while Joyce is writing the book, but not visible in 1904. I'm not going to work my way through all of the South African encounters in the novel. People like Marilyn Reisbaum, Keith Booker, and Barbara Temple Thurston, and others have done that already. Nor am I going to trace out, for the most part, the sustained and meaningful encounters between Joyce's work and that of South African writers like Louis Nkosi, Eskion Palele, Nick Mhlongo, and Alex Laguma, Nadine Gordimer, and especially Zoe Wickham. In a different version of this talk, Zoe Wickham comes in part because of the, well, I won't go into it because then I'll get lost, but it's Zoe Wickham's book, David's Story. Instead, the paper will take a likely autobiographical route by reference to my own experience of teaching Ulysses in South Africa, a book that made a difference in a place where literature really does make a difference, staging an encounter between Ulysses and 21st century students far removed from Dublin, and asking how calls for curricular change and what is called decolonization in the South African Academy over the last 8 years might be a waymarker to thinking about what encounters with Ulysses in its second century of existence might look like. In one sense, this paper is very directly about the future of what we'll teach in the humanities and how we will teach it. It doesn't offer answers necessarily, but it poses the question repeatedly. And I'm going to start with Lestrygonians, the 8th chapter, or 8th episode of the book. And I want to start with the question of what an encounter is in this book that has made a difference. Because at its heart, it's riddled not only with what we might call encounters, but also with moments that ask us to tease out the dynamics of cultural encounters at a time of narrowing nationalism. And I take that as one of the questions at the heart of this series of talks. Here's an excerpt. We'll start with, this is a longish excerpt. I have to warn you, but it's not complicated. An excerpt from just one of a number of fleeting encounters in the Lestrygonians episode. Bloom is lost in a very pleasant memory of Molly coming home from a performance and thinking of her in bed, when he's interrupted by Mrs. Breen, whom he runs into, and she's keen for a chat. Swish and soft flop her stays made on the bed, always warm from her, always liked to let herself out. Sitting there after till near two, taking out her hairpins. Molly tucked up in Betty house. Happy. That was the night. Oh, Mr. Bloom, how do you do? Oh, how do you do, Mrs. Breen? No use complaining. How's Molly those times? Haven't seen her for ages. In the pink, Mr. Bloom said gaily. Sorry, I'm going to read from a different screen here, so I'm keeping tabs on what you're seeing. In the pink, Molly Bloom said gaily, Millie has a position down in Mullingar, you know. Go away. Isn't that grand for her? Yes, and a photographer is there. Getting on like a house on fire. How are all your charges? All on the baker's list, Mrs. Breen said. How many has she? No other in sight. You're in black, I see. You have no... No, Mr. Bloom said. I've just come from a funeral. Going to crop up all day, I foresee. Who's dead, when, and what did he die of? Turn up like a bad penny. Oh, dear me, Mrs. Breen said. I hope it wasn't any near relation. May as well get her sympathy. Dignam, Mr. Bloom said, an old friend of mine. He died quite suddenly, poor fellow. Heart trouble, I believe. Funeral was this morning. Your funeral's tomorrow when you're coming through the rye. Diddle, diddle, dum, dum, diddle, diddle. Sad to lose the old friends, Mrs. Breen's woman eyes said melancholily. Now that's quite enough about that. Just quietly, husband. And your lord and master? Mrs. Breen turned up her two large eyes. Hasn't lost them anyhow. Oh, don't be talking, she said. He's a caution to rattlesnakes. He's in there now with his law books, finding out the law of libel. He has me heart scalded. Wait till I show you. Hot mock turtle vapor and steam of new baked jam puffs roly-poly poured out from Harrison's. The heavy noon reek tickled the top of Mr. Bloom's gullet. Want to make good pastry, butter, best flour, demerara sugar, or they'd taste it with the hot tea. Or is it from her? A barefoot Arab stood over the grating, breathing in the fumes. Deaden the gnaw of hunger that way. Pleasure or pain, is it? Penny dinner. Knife and fork chained to the table. Opening her handbag, chipped leather, hat pin. Ought to have a guard on those things. Stick it in a chap's eye in the tram. Rummaging. Open. Money. Please take one. Devils if they lose sixpence. Raise Cain. Husbands barging. Where's the 10 shillings I gave you on Monday? Are you feeding your little brother's family? Soiled handkerchief. Medicine bottle. Pastille that was, fell. What is she... There must be a new moon out, she said. He's always bad then. Do you know what he did last night? Her hand ceased to rummage. Her eyes fixed themselves on him, wide in alarm, yet smiling. What? Mr. Bloom asked. Let her speak. Look straight in her eyes. I believe you. Trust me. She speaks of her husband, whom, of course, is keen to move with his day. He's polite. He's engaged. He can speak with her for a while longer before she runs off after her husband. It is, as so many parts of Bloom's day are, an encounter with an acquaintance whom he does not know well, and whom he's not all that pleased to see. He's on his way to lunch, and Mrs. Brink's concern with her husband's growing insanity is not anything that Bloom cares to hear about. He's starving. He smells the aroma. He loses interest, as you see, and reminds himself to engage with her against his instincts, to let her see that he's listening, that he cares. But on the whole, it's an irritation to him, and he struggles to remember the details of her life that would allow him to carry on a conversation with her. How many children does she have? What is her husband's name? Since he doesn't know her that well. The encounter does have a narrative function for us, the reader, beyond being one of several such encounters in the opening chapters. We learn, for example, that Millie is working in a photographer's studio, something we've not heard from Bloom before. And this helps us to piece together a story about some young men who fancy their chances with Millie. Bloom thinks that he'll be asked all day long about his morning clothes, but he also can't go home to change because he doesn't want to interrupt Molly's plans for the day. And we see narrated the feeling that we all know but rarely admit to: impatience, irritation under an outwardly pleasant, engaged skin. It's a comic interlude, surely not one to make too much of. But the whole day is made up of these throwaway moments, what appear haphazard but arrange themselves into a pattern of encounters, each in their way superficial, polite, unwished for, each a point of irritation, but each also an invitation to Bloom and to his interlocutors to engage with another human on the street, to move outside of their own world, their own lives, their own thoughts, and to listen and to encounter and to learn from those around him. Lestrygonians, the 8th episode, is full of these kinds of encounters, since it's one of a small number of chapters at the beginning of the book in which Bloom truly is wandering the streets of Dublin. We know the book as being, we have Bloom wandering the streets, but actually a lot of this takes place in static places around the city. But this is one of these places where Bloom is actually moving around and encountering the streets. And I want to bring us to another scene of encounter. This is shorter, I promise you. This one remembered as Bloom wanders in front of Trinity College. This is a scene that will bring us closer to the rest of this paper as we follow down a path of protest, riot, and South African history, and think about how the book stages encounters across spaces and times of anti-colonial activism in the early 20th century. As Bloom passes the front gate, he remembers a protest against the colonial secretary, Joe Chamberlain, that he got caught up in. Bloom's protest is one of the ubiquitous historical traces that fill the pages of the novel. There was indeed a protest that took place on that spot on the 18th of December, 1899. Chamberlain was being honored with a degree from Trinity College, and a sizable group of activists turned up to highlight the injustice of the award for Chamberlain while the South African War was taking place. The protesters, whose sympathies lay with the Boers, were forced down Dame Street away from Trinity. When they were met on Parliament Street by mounted policemen from Dublin Castle, violence broke out. Protest and riot began to shade into each other at the point at which the demonstrators encountered the law. True to Bloom's form, it's difficult to parse his allegiances at this moment in the novel, as memories of the sounds and confusions of the day come crowding back into his head. That horse police, this is Bloom thinking to himself, that horse policeman the day Joe Chamberlain was given his degree in Trinity, he got a run for his money, my word he did. His horse's hoofs clattering after us down Abbey Street. Lucky I had the presence of mind to dive into Manning's or I was souped. He did come a wallop, by George, must have cracked his skull on the cobblestones. I oughtn't have got myself swept along with those medicals and the Trinity jibs and their mortarboards looking for trouble. Still, I got to know that young Dixon who dressed that sting for me in the Matter, and now he's in Holles Street where Mrs. Purefoy. Wheels within wheels. Police whistle in my ears still, all skedaddled. Why he fixed on me? Give me in charge. Right here it began. Up the Boers, 3 cheers for De Wet. We'll hang Joe Chamberlain on a sour apple tree. Silly billies. Mobs of young cubs yelling their guts out. Vinegar Hill, the Butter Exchange Band. A few years' time, half of them magistrates and civil servants. War comes on, into the army, helter-skelter. Same fellows used to weather on the scaffold high. Oh, skipping ahead there. That's not a scene from Ulysses. A chance encounter, but one freighted with political meaning. Was Bloom there out of solidarity with the Boers? Was he just caught up in it all? Did he think the protesters silly billies at the time, or just now in hindsight? And if the real action of the day took place on Dame Street and Parliament Street, south of the Liffey, why was Bloom ducking into a pub on Abbey Street, north of the Liffey? Manning's pub at 41 Upper Abbey Street was near enough to the action to be a reasonable point of escape. But the distance from the action is also revealing. The protest had actually started in Beresford Place, not as Bloom suggests outside Trinity, so Bloom was late to the party, and was broken up early on by police, with the leaders and a crowd behind them moving on to the gates of Trinity. Bloom was swept along with the medical students and doesn't seem to have been at the start of the protest on Beresford Place. There's no real sense at any point here that Bloom has thought through the politics of this encounter. What we're left with is rather impressions of the cacophonous and onomatopoeic soundscape, clattering, wallop, cobblestone, skedaddle, helter-skelter, a jumble of consonants tumbling down on top of each other. If there's one identifiable reason for Bloom to be there on the day, it's his dislike for the police. But how that dislike is articulated with the anti-colonial politics driving the protest is left for us to imagine. The whole series of reminiscences has been set and trained by Bloom seeing a squad of constables and musing on when the best time would be to attack them. Bloom really is not sympathetic to policemen, and a lot of this has to do with questions of anti-Semitism in the novel. At pudding time, apparently, is the best time to attack them, when you can give a policeman a punch in his dinner. Bloom still thinking about food. After the memory of the excitement of the day flashes into his mind, he turns to a quietist and gradualist position, more identifiably Bloomian, dismissing the flash of youthful rebellion in the Trinity students. But the riot of that day cannot be so easily dismissed. Its shadow lives on in the streetscapes of the novel, while its echoes can be heard in its soundscape. Something has ruptured, and all the good-natured, though also in this episode hungry, musings of Bloom as he traverses the city on a sunny Thursday in June cannot dispel the fact and the encounter and the memory of a riot that day or of a protest. Public space retains a riotous memory. The fabric of the city retains a memory of the sounds of that moment. So I'm going to switch a little bit here and talk about teaching Ulysses, but I want to give you an idea of the way that encounters are staged in Ulysses. If we think about encounters in the novel, and now we might sort of think about encountering the novel. In early 2012, I taught Ulysses for the first time. I was teaching in what was then the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, where final year students had to take a semester-long lecture series on modernism. While the attendant seminars that went with the semester ranged widely across Anglophone modernisms, including African literature, the lecture series, which was sort of the flagship part of the course, took a narrower line on what constituted modernism. Eliot loomed large, as did Woolf, Pound, and a portrait of the artist as a young man. It was an unremarkable course, I would say, that would be familiar to any student of modernism at the turn of the 21st century. In 2011, my colleagues and I decided that we would experiment, not radically though, with adding Ulysses to the syllabus, knowing that it would reach some of the 200 or so students in the class who would read it to the end, and perhaps not others. There were intellectual and ethical risks involved in choosing Ulysses for a lecture series and giving students just about 3, I think nearly 4 weeks to read it. At the very least, there was the question of its notorious difficulty, which was particularly acute, and is not to say that we should shy away from difficulty, especially when we're we're teaching modernism. But this was particularly acute given the linguistic landscape of South Africa, where under 10% of the population at the time, although a much larger percentage of students at the University of Cape Town, spoke English as a home language. This would be a particularly difficult engagement with them. One of the greatest challenges in teaching Ulysses was to find ways to stage a meaningful encounter between a forbidding then 90-year-old European text and the experience of a generation of Southern Africans born mostly just before the first free elections in South Africa in 1994. The work of a generation of scholars writing mostly in the 1990s and early 2000s, so around the time that these students were born and were growing up and were young students in a changing South Africa. So the work of this generation of scholars pointed to a possible approach, reading Ulysses as a rich historical document that offers an account of the structure of feeling of a day under colonial rule. Written as that colonial rule came under increasing strain from protest and revolution. We could think about this as a phrase that Nadine Gordimer uses and Stephen Klingman used to talk about South African literature before 1990, before Nelson Mandela was released from prison. A literature that foreshadows the future, that foreshadows, that is sort of proleptic of a time when apartheid will no longer be the governing system. And she calls this, Nadine Gordimer calls this the interregnum. And in a way, Ulysses too is the interregnum. And Joyce is writing about the feeling of what an interregnum is. The contrapuntal co-emergence of the Irish state and of Ulysses as a novel is readily documented in Enda Duffy's subaltern Ulysses, where Duffy writes that the novel is, quote, nothing less than the book of Irish post-colonial independence. The claim was explosive and somewhat overblown, like the IRA bomb with which the book opens. But Duffy's book made a strident and profoundly influential argument for Ulysses as a novel fundamentally oriented towards an anti-colonial politics. It was not, however, a manifesto for post-colonial freedom, Duffy argued, but, quote, a representation of the discourses and regimes of colonial power being attacked by counter-hegemonic strategies that were either modeled on the oppressor's discourses or were only beginning to be enunciated in other forms. The argument is a canny one, and it accounts for the novel's orientation toward, but inability to yet enunciate or articulate, a political horizon beyond empire. At the same time, the nuanced position has a tendency to get lost behind a thoroughgoing argument in most of the book for Joyce as an engagé anti-colonial activist, a little bit hard to take, and yet a compelling argument. At the same time as it negotiates the Irish Revolution, the novel also traces quite carefully the South African War, as I suggested, which features regularly and often obliquely, and not just in Bloom's memory of the protest in Dublin. There's no shortage of ways to read this as a novel with a particular, if submerged, South African obsession, written by a writer who thought twice about emigrating to South Africa. Amazing stories. Stephen's reference to khaki Hamlets, the absent-minded beggar, a rumor that Parnell had escaped to South Africa to become a Boer general, De Wet, and much more, all offer a sense of the omnipresence of one anti-colonial rebellion in the unfolding of another. And of course, Joyce's work had been a lodestar of sorts for many South African writers in the last century. This is a reading of Ulysses in South Africa that drew on post-colonial approaches to the novel in order to signal its availability, I thought, to readers in contemporary Southern Africa. But it's also an approach that is, as Nicholas Brown writes disapprovingly, I love this phrase, Nicholas Brown says, it's an approach that's more or less vulgar or thematic, relying on a shared colonial history, no matter how radically different, to insist on the capacity of the novel to offer insights into the African continent today. I've spent much of the time since I first taught Ulysses rethinking this position and asking what the future is for this post-colonial reading of the novel. If the post-colonialism of these voices of the 1990s and 2000s has in many cases been superseded by a newer generation of critics and questions, and has been hollowed out from one side by world literature and from another by global South studies, what future is there for the post-colonial Ulysses? Postcolonialism as a field has always made an explicit bargain with the politics of the present, a capricious guide for any kind of intellectual work, and has insisted on its own attention to history. I never taught Ulysses in South Africa again after that time, for I left that year to come to Georgetown. Indeed, after 2015, it was hard to imagine how anyone would teach it, or at least in a way that focused on the centrality of Ireland as post-colonial precursor. In 2015, a protest that would not feel out of place as a minor incident in Ulysses, largely because of its sort of scatological nature, but that had major repercussions. An activist threw shit at a statue of Cecil John Rhodes on the campus of the University of Cape Town. This, of course, will be familiar to any of you who are listening to this call from Oxford. The statue was prominently displayed on the pedestrian route from many of the student residences to the academic core of the campus. And Rhodes was cast, as my colleague Hedley Twiddle notes, in the mold of Rodin's thinker. This was, of course, a brutal irony given Rhodes's predilections and shortcomings. The activist who threw the shit was Chumani Makwele, a student of political science, and he had picked up the shit in Cóilín, a vast suburb of mostly informal housing on the outskirts of Cape Town, where city services, among them sewer services, are totally inadequate to the size of the population. The parlous state of Cóilín and other suburbs is perhaps the very embodiment of the theory of the conscious development of underdevelopment in South Africa. From that one act of protest, which had crystallized actions already underway for years to transform radically the higher education complex of South Africa, grew a movement that we now know as Rhodes Must Fall. It grew rapidly out of the frustrations, fears, and anger of a generation born free, for whom the university system in particular, and the political and economic structures of South Africa in general, had failed in any meaningful way to change in the aftermath of the end of apartheid. The movement's collectively authored manifesto, published just days after the initial performative act, ranged from immediate demands, remove the statue, to some that take much more significant work. The removal of the statue, manifesto's authors wrote, will not mark the end, but the beginning of the long overdue process of decolonizing the university. And in fact, one of the signs that featured very prominently when the statue was removed just a few weeks later said, "We're not done yet." This is one of the stated long-term goals in the manifesto beyond the removal of the statue. Implement a curriculum which critically centers Africa and the subaltern. By this, we mean treating African discourse as the point of departure through addressing not only content, but languages and methodologies of education and learning, and only examining Western traditions insofar as they are relevant to our own experience. The movement grew over the next couple of years and took root in other universities, most notably at the University of the Witwatersrand, but also obviously at Oxford and elsewhere, and in the US, in fact here at Georgetown, where when there were protests against the naming of buildings after the slave-owning Jesuits of the early years, some of those protests explicitly mentioned Rhodes Must Fall as a sort of precursor, and I'm going to talk a little bit more. I won't have time to go into detail about this idea of political precursors in these kinds of moments. Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall have changed the landscape of higher education in South Africa and put on notice the educated classes, especially those brought up in the spirit of South African liberalism and for whom transformation, that watchword of the post-apartheid era, has been a useful object of worship. An early passage of the UCT Rhodes Must Fall manifesto highlights Steve Biko's coruscating criticism of white liberals. The white liberal must understand, Biko writes, that the days of the noble savage are gone, that the blacks do not need a go-between in this struggle for their own emancipation. The pace and the goals of transformation in South Africa have been too slow for too long, and they have been inadequate to the project of achieving racial justice in the wake of apartheid. A protest in 2015 like this, or even 2023, is and always will remain a renewal with a difference of earlier anti-apartheid protests of 1976 or 1984, or whichever date you choose, 1960, the Sharpeville massacres. As long as the injustice remains intact. The Rhodes Must Fall activists took pains to suture their protest to an inherited activist past, and yet not have it be defined solely by the past. The memories of Rhodes Must Fall are dynamic and active. For Keith Michael Baker and Dan Adelstein, two political scientists who think about the way that we sort of tell ourselves about political activism, every moment of political revolution is in some sense scripted in advance in this way. And this ties us back to Ulysses, I promise. With the script constituting a frame within which a situation is defined and a narrative projected. This sense of overlapping and recurring significations of political action over centuries sustains the layered landscapes of Joyce's Dublin, with its portals and passageways from present to past and future as a form of radical reformation of time. At the same time, the litany of Global South writers of Joycean descent, though Joyce's script is always renewed under contestation, make for a different kind of trans-historical imagination. So we think about the trans-historical imagination in Ulysses, where one event is always foreshadowed by what has come before, that great phrase, coming events cast their shadow before. And then always has a long tail in what will come after. And this is partly, Bloom's obsession with the word metempsychosis, or what he calls the transmigration of souls, what we might also call reincarnation. But so the litany of Global South writers who sort of draw from Joyce make for a different kind of trans-historical imagination than that we see in the novel. Michaela Bronstein has written about this kind of trans-historicism in her study of modernist writers from the early 20th century whose work reappears out of context later in the century, as well as other locations. Bronstein offers a theory of how novels reach into a future unknowable to them, not by avoiding history, but by adapting to history. To read transhistorically, this is Bronstein, is neither to read ahistorically, nor to suggest that art is in some way universal. The transhistorical, in this sense, does not merely oppose the historical. It is its own form of history. Literature is embedded in history, but not always, and only the history of its moment of production. It makes an aesthetic appeal to the future, but an appeal that has political uses. And so I want to think for the rest of the remaining few minutes of this talk, I want to think about that idea of literature having that sort of appeal, that transhistorical appeal. But by what may be, in part because that's what we do when we teach and when we say that a book, that a place, that a thing, that a performance has a particular reason and a particular resonance. So Michael Scott and I were just talking about the Ralph Fiennes performance of Macbeth right now, which sort of resonates with Gaza in a particular choice. And we need to think about, like, what do we do when we make those questions? What do we do when we say that the book that makes a difference retains its possibility and its explanatory frameworks? What do we mean by the trans history of the text? And with what tags does the text emerge into the present? And indeed, how is that emergence negotiated by a geographical context? How does a protest, how does a riot, an action, how does an encounter, a new encounter, or a revolution open a rift in the transhistorical transmission of the text? These are the questions that are raised by the work of reading Ulysses as a guide to the current moment of decolonization. Though we might insist on its capacity to explain and absorb the shocks of the present, to provide comfort or explanation, to mediate an encounter, and it does all of those things, there must be a point at which we stop trying to accommodate Ulysses to the present and ask about modernism's own historicity, its strangeness to the present. How do we see the origins of our present possibilities in the literature of the past without collapsing differences or romanticizing the ruptures of the present as reemergences of a hallowed past? The genealogy of protest in South Africa is alien to Ulysses, and Ulysses to it. And yet we stage an encounter when we read it in a particular place. In the midst of all of these protests, a collective of UCT students devise a play about the movement. The Fall is the name of the play, and it marks its place in a change of actions and reflections, stitching together all of these particular kinds of anti-apartheid protests from 1960, 1976. It's a moving piece of theater, both on the page and on the stage, weaving quiet reflection and rousing call and response singing, a spare stage and projected images of mass protest and violence against the protesters. Where the play sometimes tends towards rehearsal of political positions, which can get a little bit tiring, it almost immediately undercuts these with personal accounts. Ambivalence and righteousness rub up against each other in the play. The part of the play that's relevant, if tangentially, to Ulysses and to our discussion today, comes in the third of 10 short scenes, Sharing in Downtime, in which the characters sit around while occupying the administration building on campus and talk about what brought them to this place and this protest. They tell the story of how, as Kaya says in the first scene, we went from UCT students to Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is the armed wing of the ANC, real fast. Kamikaze, this is one of the students. This is the scene. I will say that I saw this play as somebody who used to teach in this English department and used to teach the course of this that these people are talking about. Kamikaze, the first time I felt other than this university was in first year English class. To Camilla, yeah, you were there. The lecturer was brilliant. The only reason I knew he was brilliant was because, this is not me, by the way, was because he talked about, because of how much the white kids ummed and ahed every time he spoke. He kept throwing around those big English words, and the only people who could catch them were the white kids and the ones who went to Model C schools. I loved him. Ugh, she loved him. Dude, the content, it was ridiculous. We read these two problematic books, one after the other. Passage of India and Hard Redness? No, that's Zexanda. Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad. Okay? Anyway, now, if you've read those books, you know that black people are portrayed as savages, and the lecturer just throws them at us. No discussion. He doesn't even make you critically analyze the Western view of the black body. And then, when we finally got to do African literature for like just 2 months out of the entire year, the white students sat at the back of the lecture hall and made fun of the African lecturer's accent. I'm taking Kawikaze didn't do her degree in English, but if she had, she wouldn't have been swayed, I imagine, by my attempts to make Joyce African. It may have struck her as a new universalism in the name of postcolonialism. There are callouts to other disciplines in the play too, history and film and media studies, but it's the English curriculum that's highlighted here at the point at which protesters' general principles are translated into specific curricular action points. While the Rhodes Must Fall Manifesto offers principles that anyone who thinks about racial justice today would struggle to disagree with, the outworking of those principles on a course-by-course, discipline-by-discipline, department-by-department basis is arresting. Modernism is in the crosshairs. Not, of course, that the play is such a brittle application of the manifesto. It is, in fact, a very subtle meditation on the wide spectrum of grievances, solutions, fears, and hopes of committed and tentative fallists. These critiques of European modernism are familiar. Honestly, they're old hat. And many of us have probably leveled them ourselves, even as we appreciate Forster and Conrad's place in the development of modernist prose and the centrality of a liberal anti-imperialism to their work. But here on the stage, they are felt and communicated in a way that leaves no room for uncertainty. Protest, riot, and the rapid dismantling of a curriculum that no amount of nuanced reframing can now salvage. There is no assured place here for a literature of a different decolonization. There is no way that we can say that the Ulysses that makes a difference in its moment of publication, or that might make a difference in Ireland today, can do the same thing in South Africa. Where does Ulysses fit in this new curriculum? How do we find space for a post-colonial classic in an emerging critical conversation? Or should we still seek to find space for it? At the very least, Ulysses enters its second century and enters a wider geographical sort of range of places where it can and must and should be read and where it's available, from a significantly less assured place in the global classroom and with an unsure future. Readers and teachers will be challenged to say how its concerns are articulated with a new phase of decolonization, one that centers the global South as a producer of knowledge and a generator of theories, and one in which the Irish experience of decolonization is, unlike in the early 20th century, not a template for a global movement, but a sort of a historical relic of an idea. The point may well be not to wield Ulysses as a guide to the politics of the future, but to revisit its pages through the lens of what seems to us from this vantage point, and provisionally, a politics of the future. It is not the case that we somehow must continue to teach Ulysses everywhere literature is taught, but that if we do continue to teach it, that it must be with an eye to the avant-garde of our movement, of our moment. There are many reasons why critics, including Nicholas Brown, whom I quoted earlier, do still start a reading of post-colonial modernism with Joyce and start a reading of Ulysses with its post-colonial potentialities. And just to conclude, this line of argument brings us back to the question of the transhistoricism of the novel, or its potential to resonate in the present. And I want to again sort of bring us back to this question of encounter, the way that we encounter, where we encounter, and how that encounter can be a little bit like the encounter with Mrs. Breen, a sort of a surface level irritation in many ways, or like the encounter with the protest that Bloom had, that it becomes an encounter that's sort of not entirely politically informed, that shows us the possibilities of not knowing, and yet sort of being engaged with and disengaged from simultaneously. We're talking about the potential of the book to resonate in the present, to borrow a phrase from critic Weichi Dimmock, to make a difference in the present. For Dimmock, literary texts have the capacity to resound and transform across time, moving farther and farther from their points of origin, causing unexpected vibrations in unexpected places. Rather than the enduring literary text remaining somehow stable and timeless object that transcends history, it's marked by a timeful unwieldiness. Dimmock's suggestion is promising, for it pointedly refuses to play the game of identifying literature that transcends time and space, choosing instead to value texts that are diachronic, yielding their words differently across time, I'm quoting Dimmock now, differently across time, authorizing contrary readings across the ages and encouraging kind of semantic democracy. But as new as Dimmock's reading is, it also enacts a refreshed form of canonization and insists on the possibility of the object itself remaining central thanks to its elasticity. A novel can be transhistorical thanks to some innate features that distinguish this one from another. There's a reason why we don't all read Wyndham Lewis these days, and why H.G. Wells is enjoyed but not much thought of as a sort of political theorist. I regret that. But a novel can be transhistorical thanks to some innate features that distinguish this novel from another. A suggestion that's carried forward into arguments about world literature in the last 2 decades that seek to define and institutionalize the translatable novel. If Roads Must Fall and the movements to decolonize knowledge in the global South teach us anything, it's to reject the work of finding a path, an easy path, a sort of a smooth path for old materials to re-emerge with a new luster, ready to tackle the present crisis. And yet embedded within Ulysses, entangled with those moments of riots and protests and monuments and their downfall, all of these, sort of immediate historical questions for us, is already a form of transhistorical thinking that, though it doesn't guarantee the novel's continued relevance across time and space, does at the very least toy with the idea of timelessness and timefulness and the possibility of us continuing to encounter the text. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. That's terrific. A lot to think about there. I don't know if you want to start, Mike, or you want me to start.
Why don't you start? There are no questions yet, but I hope we will get some in a moment or so.
I mean, imagine we're in a small seminar room. It's a small bunch. We can ask all the questions. We have time.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
You concentrated on the examples in terms of colonialism. One of the things that is on our minds at the moment is all to do with the way in which Jews have been through the past looked at, and Auden wrote in 1948, I think, that you couldn't look at The Merchant of Venice again in the same way after the Holocaust. And there's a passage that when with Stephen Daedalus, mark my words, Mr. Daedalus, England is in the hands of the Jews in all the highest places of finance, of press, and they are the signs of a nation's decay. As sure as we are standing here, the Jew merchants are already at their work of destruction. Old England is dying. And it just seemed to me that that here, within the context of what you were saying, here Joyce is iterating something which just 10 years later is going to break out, that anti-Semitism that broke out in the 1930s in England, Oswald Mosley and all the rest of it, and worse still, it's not talking about just England. It's talking about Europe. It's talking about Germany. It's talking about embedded ideology of discrimination. And then how do you put that now within the debates, the terrible debates that are going on within Gaza and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
within Israel and Iran and so on. These are really complex issues that are hovering about, forces challenging cultural encounters, if you like, but challenging it in a hostile way.
Yeah.
And how do you think he actually exposes all of that?
Yeah, I mean, Auden's point says something to us about Shakespeare, which is that Shakespeare does something that Joyce doesn't. Now, there's a lot of years in between them, so I'm gonna let Shakespeare off the hook here. Not quite, but what he doesn't do is sort of create a supple critique of, or sort of, I think I use that, Raymond Williams phrase, the structure of feeling, which I think very much in terms of Joyce, is that the anti-Semitism that's in the novel is read and reproduced and rethought of and thought over and over again in different ways. That it becomes not a sort of a simple version of like, this is what DC says, DC is bad, because DC is bad. He's terrible in every possible way. He is terrible. This character who gave us this sort of anti-Semitic screed. But when they're going to the funeral, so 11 o'clock, Bloom is going to a funeral.
Yeah.
And he's in a carriage with some people, including Simon Daedalus, Stephen's father. And Simon Daedalus is a nasty character, although very, very funny. He has a phrase, he'd give you a heartburn on your arse, which might be one of the most useful phrases in the English language. And Bloom himself, when they start talking about a moneylender called Reuben J. Dodd, Bloom himself falls over himself to tell an anti-Semitic story about Reuben J. Dodd. Bloom, who we know is Jewish by descent, although having been baptized twice, but sort of a faux baptism. And so we see him falling over himself in order to ingratiate himself with the people in the carriage. Later we see Stephen, actually towards the very end of the novel, when Stephen and Bloom have already been hanging out. We see Stephen engaging in and singing an anti-Semitic song, and then immediately regretting having done that, reminding himself that while that's sort of in the air of that moment, and while that song is popular, that he's singing it in front of Bloom. And so, I mean, it is not an answer to Gaza or Iran or anything else, but I think one of the ways, and this is the question that we might think about, is why I continue to teach it, and why I still, despite the questions that I ask, I still think that that this is an active novel of what it feels like to live through a particular moment of dramatic political and historical change. And it doesn't feel clear. It doesn't feel like there's a teleology. It doesn't feel like there's a place that it's going. We feel like we're wandering in the fog in many ways. And what Joyce sort of puts in front of us is that very feeling of wandering in the fog, and the imagination of like how that might play out historically. In fact, DC is one of these people who says all human history tends towards God, the sort of the teleology of the knowledge of where we're going. And Stephen Daedalus rejects that. He just outright rejects it, his sort of Aristotelian view of human history, and also God being that thing in the street that we don't know of. And so part of the texture of the novel is the very impossibility of being able to think our way through in any kind of reasonable way, without potentially engaging in violence, to think our way through complex political positions. And then sometimes you have to. So Bloom doesn't take a position on anything all through the novel. And then in the Cyclops episode, he encounters yet again more anti-Semitism. And it's a sort of a nationalist anti-Semitism that asks him, what is your nation? And the assumption by the person who asks him, what is your nation, is that Bloom cannot be Irish because he's Jewish. And that's the moment, the first moment, when Bloom really punches back and says, my nation is Ireland. This is my nation. It also becomes a sort of a Bloomian thing where he gives a strange definition of what is a nation, the same people living in the same place, which then turns into a joke. But anyway, I'll stop talking about it. But if we think about it, it's not just that one scene with DC. It's actually the way that entire story of anti-Semitism weaves its way through the whole day. And at various points, various characters engage with and disengage with. They tell anti-Semitic stories, then they regret doing it. All of that sort of gives us a sense of the reality of the position and also the possibility of other positions. But it's not a sort of a simple black and white, this is the bad, DC is bad, DC takes that position. No, everybody feels that. Everybody feels, except for DC, almost everybody feels a certain kind of regret at having felt that. And so we understand, the question of anti-Semitism via the complicity of the characters and yet their incomplete attempts to overcome that complicity.
Excellent. Might come back on the religious side as well. When you're dead, you're dead. Yeah. Mike, do you want to take some of the questions?
We have a couple, one comment, one question. One, I'll take the comment first from Joe Simmons. I was going to ask, what do you make of Bloom being a religious minority in a largely Catholic country? But you've answered it. Thank you. And now there's a question. One of the paradoxes of post-colonialism is that advocacy for decolonization largely came from European American thinkers themselves, Edward Said, Michel Foucault, for example, among others. Is post-colonial thought not merely the next wave of apparently benevolent European thought trying to liberate, in quotes, trying to liberate the colonies from the painful memories of historical injustices?
Isn't that the paradox of post-colonialism that it has been dealing with for a very long time? When we think about that as, I wouldn't necessarily choose Edward Said, although of course Said, sort of inherits in many ways the great philological tradition of Erich Auerbach and others, and is, very much educated in the Euro-American comparative literature sense. But that's a particular genealogy of a post-colonialism that emerged in the American Academy, in which I was trained. There's a reason why, so I actually studied with Said, and there's a reason why I did, because this was interesting and compelling to me. But post-colonialism itself, to the extent that it still exists as a field of inquiry and endeavor, and there's a constant pull and push over that, has in many ways evolved fairly rapidly over the last 25 years. And away from those particular kinds of Eurocentrist, and I think it's a reasonable critique, but those particular kind of Eurocentrist thinking towards the sort of a genealogy of thinkers from the global South. Now they can be their own kind of problematic elite thinkers, but if we think about the sort of the resurgence that the thought of Frantz Fanon has seen over the last 20 years, and thinking about the sort of a return to a particular kind of anti-colonial thinking from the global South. That's not to say that it's not sort of inherited in some way. I mean, if we, from a European tradition, if we think about, nationalism, and this is one of the places where Joyce helps us think through this, we think about nationalism as being the sort of default version of anti-colonial thinking. It's a really problematic default version of anti-colonial thinking, and that's what Bloom, much as he's not a great anti-colonial thinker, but what Bloom gives us is that he gives us that critique of the possibilities of nationalism, very much a European invention, as the idea of a liberatory politics. So in many ways, what I'm trying to think about with this work, and a book that I'm writing about Joyce and post-colonialism, is actually the way that post-colonialism has changed since the 1990s, and how Joyce is no longer a sort of a stable central character in that story. And how do we still read him from that perspective? How do we think of him as offering some kind of engagement with the world of the global South, or whether we do it all? But if we think about, we can't sort of retain our place as using Joyce as kind of our sort of central post-colonial thinker, as many people did in the 1990s, where he becomes there's a great phrase from Gayatri Spivak, who throws shade at Julia Kristeva when she says, Julia Kristeva essentially uses Joyce as his model for a feminist thinking. And Spivak was like, who would use Joyce as a model for feminist thinking? That's a ridiculous thing to do. And in many ways, that's the same question. So Joyce as a model for a new post-colonialism and from a new idea of a thinking that is derived from and driven by thinkers of the global South in concert with those in the European tradition, not against necessarily, but in concert with those of the European tradition. So it is an active and an ongoing conversation in post-colonial studies that I think in many ways, the way that we think about European texts and the way that we think about a particular sort of patrimony of these texts asks us to re-engage with those questions from the South and to say it's not just sort of deriving information and knowledge from somebody like Joyce or Edward Said or Michel Foucault, but actually thinking how Joyce and Edward Said and Michel Foucault can be rethought and reframed and re-understood, driven by questions from the South. But it's a good question. Thank you very much, by the way. Anonymous attendee, I see.
Yes, there's no name attached to the question. So.
Anything more, Mike?
No, that's all that I see.
Yeah, we're coming to the.
Well, that was Joe as well, apparently. So
yeah,
I was interested in the funeral and this the putting the water on, you know. As an old altar boy, I used to hold it, putting the water on, and then the in Paradisum, which of course is the only prayer which isn't to God. The prayer in Paradisum is actually to the person who is dead. May the angels take you into paradise. It's addressed to that person. But at the end, he says,
Bloom appreciates that.
Yeah. And in the end, he says, tiresome kind of job, but he has to say something. You know, he has to say something.
He also I think you said a little bit of Latin will, you know, elevate the conversation.
That's right.
Earlier, he thinks that the Latin will stupefy them. This time, he thinks a little Latin just to, you know, make things feel pretty.
They've got to have that. It makes them feel good to have that, have the Latin. But you've done more than that today, Cóilín. That's been a fascinating discussion. So thank you very much. And I know you've been up to your eyes and are just about to go off to Ireland with Mike Collins. I wish you both well in your week's work out there. Thank you, those of you who've joined us today. I hope you will join us on Monday, April the 29th, when Joe Simmons will be talking. We look forward to that, Joe. It was good to see that you're with us today. And Joe will be talking about Pope Francis's favorite book, Manzoni's The Betrothed. So we look forward to that. That's not next week, it's the week after. It's on April the 29th, the same time as usual. We've got an interesting talk in our free speech at the International Crossroads coming up this Wednesday. I don't know how we do this. We do it almost by accident, but we're actually talking about whether you can separate works of art from the artist. This whole business about throwing the shit at the statue or pulling the statues down. We're talking about that, but we're talking also about, you know, should you actually put the works of Hitler up, his artworks up, or should you destroy the works of Hitler? How do you what do you do about Chairman Mao and the writings and the paintings of being one communication issue? So that's what we're going to be talking about this Wednesday, April the 17th. So I hope you'll join us for that. I'd like to thank Georgetown University for supporting the series, especially Jack DeJoy, the President, Vice President, Global Affairs, Tom Banshoff, also the our administrators, especially Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon. My thanks to Mike for his participation today and also for helping put these things together. Blackfriars Hall, I'm grateful to John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, and the UK administrators, Kinga Gabnai and Maggie Scott at Oxford Scott Limited. I'm Mike Scott. I'm from Blackfriars Hall in Oxford, and you can follow me on LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott or on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks again, Cóilín. Terrific talk.